Silence lay steadily in the halls of Grimmauld Place, as it had for as long as I'd lived there. It was, perhaps, a part of the building in the same way as its walls and windows. The floors creaked, the roof leaked, and the halls were silent. Get up, I told myself, and didn't. Dull rain drummed on the glass of my bedroom window. Autumn in central London was miserable and dreary and grey. I knew as much when I let Ginny keep our little cottage in Hereford after our divorce, knew that the derelict old row house would be my only option if I did, and told myself that I would be fine. I would adapt to London's climate. That had been 6 years ago. I'd since learned better. Get up, I said again, and wondered which was worse, that I was reduced to begging myself to move, or that it did not work. Distant thunder rumbled, but it was loud enough to wake the ghoul in the attic, who began immediately to wail and bang on the pipes. I sighed, and a familiar headache threatened just behind my eyes. In a way, I was grateful. Now I had no choice but to move if I wanted to avoid a persistent migraine. I rose. I bathed. I dressed. I ate. Routine gestures repeated mechanically, backlit by sluggish grey light and the deafening, echoing silence of Grimmauld Place. Always the silence. Always the silence. I went back upstairs after breakfast to grab my attaché full of case files. Taking my work home with me was a habit I'd gotten into when I was a new Auror, still enamoured with my job, or at least with the idea of it. These days it was little more than muscle memory. I would take them home, put them in my office, then ignore them all weekend long. Routine gestures repeated mechanically on the chorus of silence, always silence, always silence. On the way back down, I passed Sirius's room. My footsteps slowed, my eyes lingered. This was familiar too. The horrible, dark something that grew in the back of my throat at the sight of his closed bedroom door. Looking away was also routine, mechanical, silent, always silent. I'd received my promotion from lieutenant to head Auror 4 years ago, relieving a gratefully retiring Gawain Robards. At the time, I'd been pleased with myself, and the world had been pleased with me. It felt like a natural progression, like fulfilling an expectation, one that I told myself I was proud of, since I'd fallen short as a husband and a friend, and failed entirely to become a father. In practice, though, being head Auror was little more than misery with mystique. My duties became supervisory. I made hiring and firing decisions, kept up on investigations run by others, and allocated spending. Gone were the days of chasing down dark wizards, poring over crime scenes, and dueling in dark alleys. I was a figurehead now. My responsibilities barely even required me to leave my office. Abigail at the front desk fluttered her eyelashes at me, as she had every day since she'd learned of my divorce. My administrative assistant, Julian, offered a cheerful, "Good morning, sir," with a cup of tasteless coffee waiting for me on his desk just outside my office. "You have a meeting with the Chief Warlock at 11, Julian informed me, once I'd taken my first sip of the watery brown muck. I answered. "And the quarterly budget report needs to be finished by the end of the day, so accounting has enough time to review it before submission." Truly, the coffee was terrible. I drank it anyway. "Oh, and you have a visitor in your office. Says she knows you. Narcissa Malfoy." I stopped mid-sip. Julian must have seen my face change because he kept talking. I was surprised, too. The meeting was only put on your calendar yesterday, after hours, without my knowledge, and she was already here when I got in. I'm guessing she pulled some strings or something. I looked toward my office door. It had a long, thin window of frosted glass through which I could just barely see a flash of blonde hair on a dark shape that might have been a shoulder. "I can have someone remove her," Julian suggested, after what I belatedly realized was a too long lapse of silence. "No," My voice was rough from disuse, and I cleared my throat. "No, I'll talk to her. Please make sure we're not disturbed." "Yes, sir." He seemed confused. That was fine. His understanding was not required. My office door swung open with an enchantment that reacted to my proximity. The aging hinges shrieked, and at the sound, Narcissa Malfoy spun sharply around in the chair just opposite my desk. She hadn't aged at all since I last saw her, or else had done so with such grace that the difference was negligible, even after a decade and a half. Her long blonde hair was curled elegantly in front of her shoulder, and she was dressed all in black, save for a dainty white handkerchief clutched tightly in one thin hand. She looked out of place in the drab utilitarian space that my office had become over the years, too beautiful, too delicate for a space so plain. "Head Auror Potter," she said, standing. The office door shut behind me when I went to my desk. "Please," I said, "Harry's fine." She hesitated, as though weighing my preference against propriety. Then eventually she said, "Narcissa, then." "Narcissa," I agreed. I set my attaché on the floor beside my heavy wooden desk and the cup of lukewarm rat piss masquerading as coffee on the coaster. "I'll admit I'm surprised to see you here. I hadn't seen her at all since the war, not even in the papers, though I supposed I hadn't kept up with those in years now." "I'm surprised to be here," she answered. I sat. She sat a breath later, on the very edge of the aging wooden chair. Up close, I began to notice worrying details. Her eyes were bloodshot, her nose red, and that dainty, frilly little handkerchief had seen some use. She had been crying, I realized with some surprise, and very recently. "But," she continued slowly, "I don't think there's anyone else in this entire department who would give me the time of day, and I still felt compelled to make this meeting a surprise because, even with you, I wasn't sure." She gave me a guarded, worried look, twisting her handkerchief in both hands, and I realized, with a surprising twinge of guilt, that she was expecting me to throw her out. "You saved my life back during the war," I told her solemnly. "I do not take that lightly. You have, at the very least, earned my ear." Something small and subtle broke behind her eyes. Her shoulders sagged a fraction. Apparently, she'd been waiting for me to be combative. "That's very kind of you. As you can imagine, what connections my family retained after the war were strained, and not within the ranks of the Aurors." I could imagine, quite easily. Many of the Sacred 28 had fled for the continent before Voldemort's corpse had even cooled, and those that had stubbornly remained did so with intense scrutiny and mistrust from the rest of the magical world. The steep price of reparations hadn't helped, I was sure. I thought it best, perhaps, not to bring any of that up, in the name of keeping the peace. "How can I help you?" I asked instead. She stared hard at me. I could see the intent to answer in her eyes. Her lips parted just slightly as if preparing to, but for a long time no words came. And then, just as I was about to ask if she was feeling well, she said, "I suppose you've heard about what happened to my son." I frowned. No. "No? It was one of the Aurors under your supervision who signed off on the investigation." Why was Draco Malfoy being investigated? I almost didn't want to know. "My role is more hands-off these days," I said. "I don't get involved much in specific cases, unless it's drawn enough media attention to warrant the head Auror's intervention." A bit of silence. Then, "I see." "Why," I began, but Narcissa cut me off. "He killed himself." Something horrible clenched in the pit of my stomach. "Or that is what they tell me, at least. I will thank you not to offer any platitudes. Merlin knows I've heard them enough in recent days. I'm so sorry for your loss. I cannot imagine what you are going through. Loss does not even begin to encompass what I am feeling, and I would not condemn my worst enemy to imagine what I am going through. My son is gone. My family is unmade. I will never be whole again. Your Auror, Westerly, I believe is his name, ruled it as a suicide 4 days ago, despite my fervent protests. He closed the investigation after less than a fortnight, wholly ignoring the incredibly murky circumstances. If I thought lodging a formal complaint would do a single bit of good, I'd do it, but I'm not naive. I know anything I filed would be thrown in the bin as soon as the first set of eyes on it saw my last name. I am not here for vengeance, in any case. I'm here because you are perhaps the only person in the DMLE who would take me seriously when I say that I think your Auror is wrong. I do not think my son killed himself. I am not even fully convinced that he is dead. In the corner of my office, the grandfather clock ticked dully. Narcissa Malfoy's eyes were as bright and deadly as oncoming headlights. I see him, sometimes. Not a ghost. Him. I've been cleaning out the manor, or trying to, and I swear he is still there. I can hear his papers rustling and the scratching of his quill, his footsteps in the hall. I see his silhouette against the bay window in the library, and his figure pacing the gardens. And at night I hear... He weeps. He screams. Can you even begin to understand what that feels like, Harry? To hear your own son, the child you gave life to, weeping as though every beat of his heart is torture? To follow the sound of it in circles for hours, but to never find its source? I know what you would say, and it's nothing I haven't said to myself. I am a widow who lost her only son. I am racked with grief and hallucinating. But I am not a hysteric. I do not hear or see him anywhere else, just the manor. And though his wretched half-presence digs jagged claws into my soul every time, still I crave it. I am in agony for it. Because if he haunts me, at least I still have some shred of him left. The Malfoy Manor is an ancient building, powerful and strange. The land itself has magic in it older than words, older than the first civilizations to form on these isles. It is not impossible that he is something other than living or dead. And I think he is. I think he is. Or, Harry, you are kind, but most vitally, you are capable. You have a decade of experience with dark magic, how it works and how to master it. And you will not hurry along an investigation because you believe its victim unworthy of your time. I will beg you if I must. Come to the manor. Reopen my son's case. See for yourself. Perhaps my son is dead, but that does not mean he is not trapped. The case file number was 11629307. It was only 2 pages long, and had been closed last Thursday by Officer Vance Westerly. Disposition, suicide. Not suspicious. You didn't even perform an autopsy, I said when I hauled Westerly into my office less than an hour later. Westerly shifted nervously in the same seat which Narcissa Malfoy had wept in when I agreed to look into it. Good, I thought. Squirming was the very least he deserved. There, wasn't a body? There wasn't a body? It does happen sometimes, sir, Westerly hastened to point out. It's a rare phenomenon, of course, but not unheard of. When the master of an ancestral magical estate like the Malfoy Manor dies in situ, the building, it can sometimes... Spit it out, I barked, which made him flinch. It can sort of... eat them? It's called Dimino Devorato. The implication horrified me, but did not entirely surprise me. After living in Grimmauld Place for half a decade, I was intimately familiar with the strange and temperamental magics that grew in old ancestral homes. But it wasn't what mattered. Sometimes, sort of. The rage I felt was almost refreshing. How long had it been since I'd felt anything at all with such intensity? So you wrote off a blood-soaked bed without a corpse on it as a suicide, not suspicious, because sometimes a house can sort of eat its master? Sir, it explains the lack of body perfectly. You know what else explains a lack of body? A lack of death. Westerly's face had gone slightly grey. Sir, the amount of blood found. You didn't bother verifying that the blood actually belonged to Draco Malfoy. You didn't even interview his mother, and I know she begged you to investigate the matter more thoroughly, so either you're stupid enough to be unfamiliar with protocol after 4 years of service, cruel enough to disregard a grieving mother's pleading, or lazy enough to avoid due diligence by calling it all not suspicious. Which is it, Westerly? Sir, he squeaked, hands gripping the chair's armrests as though there was nothing else tethering him to earth. Am I being sacked? I sacked Westerly. I wasn't sure I believed that Draco Malfoy was in some limbo between life and death. I wasn't sure I believed Narcissa's insistence that she wasn't hallucinating. But I was sure that both of them deserved better than the pathetic excuse for an investigation that they had received. I sent Narcissa an owl before I left work that day, saying that I would be coming to the Malfoy Manor on Friday with a new investigative team, and to please leave the bed, where her son was rather specifically not found, as it was. The first step was putting together a more competent and assiduous team. Inspectors the DMLE had in spades, and I hand-selected a half-dozen with the best solve rates. I then went to the 9th floor to ask the liaison for the Department of Mysteries about whether I might requisition a consultant for the investigation, and she recommended I hire on a familiar name. Professor Trelawney, thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Please, my dear, you've long since graduated. You have earned the right to call me Sybil. The divination classroom was much as I remembered it, save for the rack of horseshoes by the door, indicative of Firenze's continued presence in the castle, which made me wonder whether or not centaurs could apply their own horseshoes. It also made me wonder how he got up and down the stairs. Thankfully, my train of thought was diverted. I did suspect this day would come, of course. Sybil Trelawney, on the other hand, had changed a great deal. Silver striped her once brown hair, and crow's feet and laugh lines had found purchase on her face. Her eyes, though, were still huge and hazel, and her shawls still glittered. I smiled indulgently at her, or at least I hoped it looked indulgent and not pitying. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Your arrival is one day after a blood moon, you know. They are great heralds of woe. Please, sit. I sat. The little tables with their little crystal balls had never felt quite so little, which I supposed made sense. After all, they were meant for children. My knees knocked against the wood as I crossed my legs and rattled the teacups she'd set out for us both. You come for prophecy, she said knowingly, and summoned the teapot that had been on the fire to pour. No, not this time. She blinked at me owlishly through her thick spectacles. No? No. I'm actually here to hire you on as a consult for a case I'm working on. As a medium, not a seer. My cup clanked loudly against its saucer as she knocked it with the teapot spout, but not quite hard enough to spill anything. She looked up at me sharply. It wasn't the reaction I'd been anticipating. You come highly recommended from the Department of Mysteries. I'm told that you're the finest medium alive. With exhaustive care, she set down the teapot on the hand-knit cozy beside the crystal ball. Then she stared into her lap and began to fidget. Yes, she eventually said, mediumship is in my repertoire, although I prefer not to speak with those beyond the veil. I tried, I suspected unsuccessfully, to hide my surprise. You don't? It is a great deal riskier, you understand, than peering through the mists of time. One might predict the future, be wrong, and suffer no ill effects, but speaking with the dead... "The ghosts all over Hogwarts," I replied, perplexed. "But ghosts have not passed beyond the veil. Their bodies have died, but their spirits remain on Earth. Once a soul leaves this world entirely, contacting them becomes a great deal more hazardous." I frowned. I'd never really trusted Trelawney's second sight, but the Department of Mysteries liaison had sworn up and down that she was a peerless medium, and if even she hesitated to use the gift... "I see. Are you sure there's no way to avoid such a circumstance?" "Perhaps," I answered uncertainly. "At the very least, I'd request for you to be with me on Friday when I reopen the investigation. If possible, I'd like for you to verify whether or not someone has died." It didn't seem to assuage her nervousness at all. "I see. It's Draco Malfoy. Did he ever take your class?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but I remember his name. Is he dead? I'm not sure. That's why I'd like for you to be there. He certainly hasn't been seen in some time, and the circumstances were rather... Evil deaths make for evil talk," she whispered. Her eyes were bigger than I'd ever seen them, her chest rising and falling rapidly. I will do this for you, Harry, because I know my prophesying has caused you great pain in the past. But you must be careful. Every contact leaves a trace, even emotion. A bad death leaves a jagged hole in the veil, and those who reach through risk being cut. I came home that night feeling jittery, like my muscles couldn't sit still beneath my skin. It had been a long walk through the Scottish Highlands to reach the edge of the anti-apparition zone that shrouded Hogwarts. Thistle had stuck to the hem of my robe, and the cold air of late autumn had stung my throat with every breath. The gloom of Grimmauld Place swallowed me whole the second I appeared within it. Back to the dust and the chill and the silence. I shivered, then went to build a fire. An exhausting day, an interesting day, the first in a long streak of soul-consuming nothing, and now I was home again, and I could feel it all leaching out of me, sucked away by the void I lived in. The fire sputtered pitifully in the hearth. Spell after spell could not make it bigger, could not warm the ice that grew in the heart of this house. I surrendered myself to being cold and sank into the armchair in front of the fireplace. A part of me wanted to visit Hermione and Ron. It had been months now since I'd seen Rose. Or I could check in on Hannah and Neville, or Molly and Arthur at the Burrow, or even Ginny. But I couldn't make myself move. The fire crackled low and insufficient, and I sat rotting in my armchair. I could not make myself believe that I was wanted or even missed. I had not seen my loved ones in so long. Perhaps they had forgotten me. Perhaps the Malfoy Manor was not the only house to eat its masters.